I have a couple of questions I'd like to start off with. There's no statute of limitations, as we all know, on murder cases. Even in cases of Medgar Evers' murder and the Birmingham girls that were firebombed, causing 4 girls to lose their lives, they were reopened, retried years later due to continued investigation. I would note parenthetically that Evers was murdered in front of his family in a way that is very similar to and parallel to Patrick Finucane's murder. So this, it seems to me, is a very disturbing bit of unfinished business. The public inquiry certainly would bring a great deal of scrutiny and light to something that has suffered nothing but shadows and an occasional breakthrough. And it does beg the question as to why the cover-up. Who are they protecting, as I think all of us are concerned about? My question, I guess, to both of you would be, in Judge Corey's report on Patrick Finucane's murder, he asserted that without public scrutiny, this is a quote, doubts based solely on myth and suspicion will linger long, fester, and spread their malignant infection throughout the Northern Ireland community. Do you agree with his assessment? And is this ongoing cover-up harming the British government's credibility?
Yes, I would agree with the assessment. Judge Corey concluded, as he did, and others who have looked at the case reached the conclusion that not only was the murder of my father as a result of the work that he was doing and the successes that he had, but also it was meant as a warning to other lawyers that if they attempted to replicate his successes or employ the same techniques or seek the same successes in the courts that he sought and achieved, then they might meet the same fate. Not only did it represent an attack on the rule of law and the position of lawyers as defenders of their clients, but it also compromised the ability of people to achieve their right to an effective legal defense, because lawyers had to now consider, defense lawyers for the first time, now had to consider whether they would be putting themselves or their families at risk by accepting work that was politically unpopular. And my father was prepared to do this. My mother, I think, said it best in the immediate aftermath of the murder that, Pat was a professional to such an extent that he would have represented the people who shot him. So fervently did he believe in the rule of law and the value of maintaining a commitment to the rule of law, even in the face of civil conflict. So I think the murder definitely had that dimension to it at the time. The ongoing effect of the killing, the surrounding circumstances, the evidence that has come to light, and the broken promise given by the British government at Weston Park is to elevate the case to a highly iconic status that is capable of being abused as a propaganda tool by people who might seek to continue the conflict. I do believe and fear that that is a risk. And it is also damaging to the British government because, quite simply, they didn't keep their word. And if a government is seen as not being capable of keeping its word or acting honourably, well then it doesn't deserve to be a government. It is clear from some of the information that has come to light as a result of the recent litigation in Belfast that the decision not to hold a public inquiry by the Cameron administration was one hotly debated within the civil service. So even within the British establishment, the danger of going back on their word, of breaking the commitment, of welching on the promise given in Weston Park was recognised and understood, and many British civil servants, including the Cabinet Secretary at the time, argued against it and expressed a lot of surprise that the Prime Minister was going down this road.
General.
One of the surprises to me after witnessing that the Prime Minister went ahead in publicly addressing the Savile inquiry and I had occasion to speak to the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland about our experience with the My Lai massacre, in which I represented the chaplain in the Peers Commission inquiry after the massacre, and how it was necessary to redeem ourselves as an institution, and I'm talking the military at that time. We had to reveal what went wrong, withhold nothing, and then trust to the American people to place their trust back in us again by coming clean on what went wrong and trying to make the institutional fixes. Suggested to them, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that my input played any role in the Secretary of State's view, but they did take that approach with the Saville inquiry, and the Prime Minister was applauded in the Guildhall Square of Derry when he made the announcement acknowledging responsibility. I thought that he was heading toward that same kind of a conclusion in having an inquiry. I had suspected for years that there was deliberate delay until Mrs. Thatcher passed away or was not able to appear before an inquiry, because it was her practice on occasion to sit in on the Joint Intelligence Committee, which had overall supervisory responsibility for the work of the Task Coordinating Group that ran things in Northern Ireland. That was a group made up of senior military and police officials. But I realize now that I was wrong in my assessment. I don't think it was Mrs. Thatcher at all. I think it was the security people at the top end, MI5 and MI6, and the remnants of special branch that continue in the police today, who, for whatever means that were at their disposal, whether it was some version of Mr. Hoover's infamous private file cabinet or for some other reason, were able to effectively block what I think Mr. Cameron was prepared to do but couldn't do.
You know, in your written testimony, thank you, Mr. Finucane, you say the review conducted by Desmond De Silva reveals a great deal of information for the first time, but it is nowhere near being a complete answer. It is based on a reading of documents without any questioning of the authors. Indeed, only 11 witnesses were spoken to by De Silva, and 12 written submissions were received. No former politicians were interviewed, nor were a number of key intelligence personnel, including the former head of military intelligence in Northern Ireland, who was in charge at the time of your father's murder. And then you point out, as if this is not bad enough, on the day that the Silva report was published, Tom King, now Lord King, led the public response on behalf of the government. He was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in 1989 when your father was murdered. You go on to say, not surprisingly, he rejected calls for a public inquiry, claiming that the matter had now been fully investigated. It is difficult to conceive, you go on to say, of someone with greater conflict of interest than the former Secretary for Northern Ireland in 1989. The dangerous suspicion that lingers around his defense of the government's position is that those responsible for the policy of collusion remain in positions of significant influence and will continue to get away with it. As a key witness at any potential inquiry held, Lord King's rejections of the calls for an inquiry merely add insult to injury. That is a very, very powerful statement. I know after the De Silva report, there were some in the Labour Party who suggested that there ought to be a public inquiry. Mind you, between 2003 and 2010, during both the Blair and Brown governments, they refused a public inquiry, but they may be seeing things a bit differently. And I'm wondering if you've heard, if you might want to further elaborate on that statement, because it doesn't get any more powerful than that, and your thought as to whether or not there might be a reevaluation going on in the House of Commons.
The position of the opposition in the House of Commons, led by Ed Miliband, is that an inquiry will be established if they are returned to government. The difficulty that arose when Labour was in power between 2003 and 2010 was the enactment of legislation that limited the manner in which inquiries would be carried out. Ministers would have control over the information that appeared before the inquiry and in public, and that control would be an absolute discretion, not subject to input from any of the parties, and would limit the ability of the inquiry to explore important issues publicly.
If I could interrupt, so are the Labour MPs suggesting that that law would not be applicable in this case? Because I too read that law and thought it was unconscionable that the ability to veto information from becoming public would lay in the hands of the very people who would have conflict of interest potentially.
Well, that was indeed the fear.
Right.
However, since the passing of that law, the Inquiries Act of 2005, a precedent has developed since in relation to a case that arose from circumstances in Iraq, where the Inquiries Act was not implemented in full for that particular inquiry, in the case of a man called Baha Musa, who was killed by British soldiers. But instead, the decision as to what material would be withheld and what material would be disclosed was left to the inquiry chairperson, and only the chairperson. And that allowed an opportunity for representations to be made in public and some measure of debate to be had as to what information the public would see. It would not be taking place in a minister's office in the way originally envisaged under the terms of the Act. That precedent was the one we wanted the government to follow. That was the one we were discussing with them for about a year between 2010 and 2011 when the Cameron-Clegg administration took power. We expected, when we went to Downing Street, to be told that this precedent was going to be followed because, if for no other reason, we were not asking for something to be created for our case. We were simply asking them to give us the same as they had given somebody else. But that obviously was refused. The position of the opposition, as I say, is that they will establish an inquiry. They will live up to the promise of Weston Park. In terms of, but until that happens, we have to endure this U-turn by the Cameron administration. And as if that wasn't bad enough, on the day the De Silva report was released, I had to experience walking past Tom King in the BBC in London as he went into one studio saying, "I'm satisfied no inquiry is necessary now, the matter has been fully investigated." And I went into another studio saying, "Well, it hasn't been investigated, and the man in the studio next door is someone I'd really like to ask a few questions of." This is just another example of how much damage is being done to the government's credibility as a result of both its decision and its choice of spokesperson. I can't think of anything more insulting than the person who was in charge at the time, who was getting briefings from the Force Research Unit, who met some of the people in charge, who was aware of the extent of intelligence available to the state, and yet is able to get away without having to answer for his actions while in office. He said that he would have been available to the De Silva review if they had asked to speak to him, but it appears they did not. In fact, they didn't ask to speak to any politicians. And it seems to me that that is a glaring void in the process that De Silva was asked to undertake, and underlines the need for a public inquiry, because there are people who should be spoken to and should be questioned who simply have not been up until now. And we really have to start doing that before more time passes and those people become unavailable.
You referenced the impact that your father's assassination had on other defense attorneys. I would just note that on September 29th, 1998, 15 years ago, a little over 15 years ago, sitting right where you sit and where General Cullen sit, we had Rosemary Nelson tell her story, especially the death threats that she had received from the RUC, and within a year, 6 months really, she had been assassinated with collusion all over the place. So, you know, killing defense attorneys, human rights defenders like your father, had an impact. I'm sure there were many attorneys who thought they might do this very noble work who decided to take a different path because of what had happened to your dad and then what happened to Rosemary Nelson. So this committee, I can assure you, will stay focused until and when the British government does the right thing, as they have promised to do, and that is to conduct a public inquiry, and they do need to hold people who allegedly have committed collusion are held to account in a proceeding that will bring justice even at this late date. I'd like to yield to Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Weber.